fucking bop. Happy New Year. I have got you in a slightly different position because I'm going to need lots of space over here for graphs because we're going to chat about some statistics because I am one of those people that likes to gamify their reading, which means I track a lot, which means I have a lot of statistics to go through at the end of the year. And then following on for that, we're going to talk about some of the goals and things I want to achieve next year, having taken into account the statistics for this year. So starting off strong, this year I started 169 books, but I only finished 120 of them, which is pretty good going. Though I will say the similarities between my ratings are very interesting to me. The graph looks like this. 20% of my reads were 5 stars, which I'm happy with. Now, we all know I love to DNF books, and so it doesn't really surprise me that I DNF'd 29% of everything I started this year. But because I did that, it left me with the 20% 5 stars, which I'm happy with. 4-star reads 30%, so just a little smidge over, I think literally by 1 book, which I'm also really happy with. If you want the actual numbers, I DNF'd 49 books and I rated 50 books 4 stars, so there's literally 1 book in that. 19% or 32 books got 3 stars and 4 books got 2 stars, and I didn't rate anything 1 star. It is very rare that I rate things 2 or 1 stars, just because I do DNF generally if I think it's going to be a bit of a shit book, but there were some that I have spoken about before where they were an audiobook and I didn't have anything better to do in that situation than finish the audiobook, so I finished the audiobook and then rated it 2 stars. I'm pretty chuffed with that. I'm not convinced that that sort of ratio of ratings will change unless my DNF habits change, and I'm quite happy with them where they are. So I would be intrigued to see if that changes this year. I'm wondering if I will have more lower starred reviews, just because I'm starting to review books for another site called The Fantasy Hive, where I might feel inclined to finish a book, particularly if it's an arc that I'm given. I don't love DNFing arcs because that feels a bit disrespectful and like I'm not holding up my end of the bargain. So who knows, we may end up with some more lower rated books this year. If we want to carry on with sort of quantity of books read, this is the stat for how those 169 books are spread across the year. I went absolutely bananas in March, and for a while I forgot how I'd created that graph, so I thought I'd actually read 23 books in March. I didn't. I read 14 books in March, which is still a lot, but I DNF'd 9 books in March. It was a lot, frankly. But it also doesn't surprise me that March, April, May are my strongest reading months because I wasn't working in that time. I was off work with stress for those months, and all I was doing was reading or job hunting in that period of time. So I had a lot of time to kill and I read a lot of books. I'm not sure that will duplicate this year. It is unsurprising to me as well that we start quite low, we have a huge dip, and then we have that huge burnout as well. Yeah, the patterns of these books they very much follow when I'm working and when I'm not, because the highest books were when I'm not working and then November, December. I'm surprised that there's so many in November, just because I had started a new job. I was also doing NaNoWriMo and I still managed to get that many books in. 17 books started is quite a lot. 17 in December doesn't surprise me at all. I had 2 weeks off for Christmas. That's pretty good. I'm happy with that. I think that's very reasonable. I think I went a bit insane when I didn't have a lot of time on my hands, but I'm happy with that. If you want to look at books finished versus books DNF'd, here are these 2 graphs. Again, doesn't surprise me that they follow the same sort of spikes as the last graph. I was very surprised to see that I DNF'd nothing in July, which I was quite impressed with. I think the one spike that surprises me in the between these 2 graphs is the September one. Like, September was a fucking terrible reading month. I DNF'd 8 books and I only managed to finish 4. What was I doing in September? I was doing a lot of walking. I was working, I guess. Don't know what happened in September. There's always going to be a dip, isn't there? But then I picked it back up again. So, moving on. So my reading goals for next year. This year I read 120 books, which I think is the most books I've managed to read in a year for a very long time. I'm very happy with that. My goal was 90. I was sort of giving myself space but I hit that back in October, I want to say. So this year I'm doing something slightly different. I have decided on an arbitrary number based on the amount of books I could draw on my bookshelf in my book journal, which is how I'm going to be wrapping up books this year. It looks like this. You will see it at the end of this month when I start filling it in. But I managed to fit 128 books on that. I wasn't counting. I was just sort of making the books big enough that I knew I could write the titles in there. And I ended up with 128. So 128 is going to be my like gold star. Will be super impressed with myself if I actually manage to hit that goal for this year. But I realised that's not reasonable, so what I'm doing is I'm giving myself a bronze, silver and gold medal. So gold is 128. My silver medal is going to be 120 because I managed it this year. I don't feel like I stressed myself out managing it this year. I read a lot. I read a lot of audiobooks as well, and I have long commutes, and I do sort of exercise and stuff where audiobooks are my preferred way to entertain myself, but also I don't want to stress myself out if that doesn't become attainable this year. So my baseline goal is going to be 110 books because 100 is a nice round number, but I hit it very easily, and I think 110 is very doable in a year. So we've got gold star 128, silver 120, and then bronze 110. I think that's a doable goal for this year. In terms of the breakdown of how I got the books, so whether I like borrowed them, if I own them already, things like that, that's the graph for this. It doesn't surprise me that 50% of the books that I read I already owned. I did have a big TBR. I volunteered at an Oxfam bookshop earlier in the year. So I ended up buying a book every other shift, if not 2 or 3. So that really stumped up my TBR. But this is much, much lower percentage-wise than previous years, just because I really started getting into using my library because it's just down the road from me. I started using Scribd as well, which is why 35% of the books that I listened to were on Scribd. I did dabble around in Audible a bit as well, but I don't like the way Audible is set up. I like the way that Scribd is set up. I prefer Scribd to Spotify just because 15 hours of listening time is nowhere near enough for me in a month. So I balance the two. I do have a Spotify subscription anyway, so I tend to save the books on my TBR that I know are going to be harder to find on Scribd. I tend to find those on Spotify and I listen to those, but otherwise Scribd is where I stick to. And they've had some absolute bangers on this year, like the Sean and Maguire series. I'm fucking ploughing through those at the moment, which is also probably why my reading stats are so high, because those are really short novellas and I can consume them in 2 hours flat, which is a commute for my one day. So assuming I don't get bored with the book, that's like a book a day if I wanted to. But I discovered this way that Scribd does have a reading limit for some books. The more popular ones, you can only read like 5 or 6 of them in a month, and then you have to wait and you're like stuck with the ones that nobody's ever heard of. So that was an interesting find. 13% of my books came from the library. I only really started using the library in the sort of second quarter of the year, but I do have a goal for that this year. I want to read 35 library books this year. How many did I read this year? So I only read 21 library books this year. I want to read 35 next year. I really want to bump it up. And I have, I'm going to be following Books and Lala's Buzzword readathon. But the way I'm doing it is that every book I pick, I have to go to my library to pick it. It can't be a book that I own. I have to physically go to my library and browse the shelves and try and pick a book that I've never heard of that fits the prompt, to just try and like spread out my reading a little bit and try some new things. So I am quite excited about that. But also the way that I use my library is I go through my Storygraph TBR and I go through the ones that I'm really excited for, and I just go through and request all of them. You can request a maximum of 20 books at my library, so that's what I do. And in the beginning I made the mistake of doing all 20 at a time, and then they were coming in like 4 or 5 books every other day. So there is a vlog earlier in the year, I think it was June, where I was just trying to plough through these library books as fast as I possibly could because other people had holds on them, so I couldn't keep renewing them. I just had to read them, which is fun, but not when there's like 4 of them and you've given yourself a week to read 4 books, then it gets a bit stressful. Ooh. I'm learning how to use my library in a way that suits me and that I'm excited for, and I deserve recognition for that. In terms of book formats, this is the graph for this. So mostly physical, big chunk of audiobooks, which doesn't surprise me that obviously it's going to be the same sort of layout as the Scribd chunk from the last graph. The reason it's a bit bigger than the Scribd chunk is because I did listen to some audible books earlier in the year. And then ebooks. I don't tend to read ebooks very often, just because I have physical books and they're more exciting to me, but they are very useful when you're traveling or when you're bored on your lunch break. My bag I take to work is not very big, so I prefer to just read a book on my Kindle app on my phone. I have recently invested in one of those clicker things for my Kindle, so I'm wondering if that will increase this year for sort of before bed reading time. I will be interested to see. One of the vlogs, videos I'm going to do at the end of this year is going to be coming back to this video and comparing stats and seeing what the difference is. And if I don't film it, I'll definitely be doing it just for myself. So those are the sort of stats from this year. Like I mentioned earlier, I am going to do my wrap-ups a little differently this year. I have got this book journal, which I am going to do my wrap-ups on here. So things that I am going to be doing is I've got obviously my bookshelves that I was talking about there, so that's 128 books with this down here, which is supposed to be a rabbit and looks like a demented kangaroo, but it's on the page now, so we're going to be looking at it for a year. I want to take part in 6 readathons. This is a semi-arbitrary number because I try and take part in Mixtapeathon every time it happens, and that happens 4 times a year, but I would like to branch out and try some others. So hopefully 2 others. Let's talk about my budget. Okay, let's talk about how much I spent on books this year, shall we? This year, I bought 141 books. Which sounds okay. Some of those were full price, some of those were secondhand, some of those were very, very cheap indeed. And this is the graph of when I bought them. March, I went a bit mental. That was when I started working for Oxfam, so I was buying books every other day. That was also when I did a big splurge on Cassandra Clare books. I decided I want to read everything in the Shadowhunters series, so I got them all secondhand, and I ended up spending about £4.72 on each book, but I bought all of them, all the ones I didn't have. And then in December I got some gift cards for Christmas and I spent them, and I ended up getting about £200 worth of books for 80 quid, which I was very, very pleased about. The Waterstones Tale was shit this year. Like it was really shit. I wasn't impressed. But the total amount that I spent on books this year was £743.80. I have no idea what that compares to other years because I've never tracked how much I've spent on books before, but that is a stupidly large number when I could be borrowing from the library, when I could be borrowing from other people, finding like more secondhand books as well. I think you can see on the graph as well, my reading sort of changed from about the May onwards. What I was doing was I wasn't just buying every book that appealed to me, I was trying to get it out the library first to see if I like it and then decide if I then wanted to buy it. That went on a wish list, which I then bought everything that I knew I wanted to have a physical copy of in December. That's why that December list is so large. Most of those books I had already read and knew that I wanted to have a copy of. A lot of them were like audiobooks that I had listened to and wanted a physical copy of, which was quite eye-opening in some cases because words were not spelled how I thought they were spelled. But that mindset is continuing on into 2024. I am going to try and only buy books that I have read and know that I like, because I want my library behind me, which is lovely and new, some of those are double stacked, to be filled with books that I know I like, and I think that's sensible. So I have a book budget this year. I am going to attempt to stay within this budget. I don't know how feasible that's going to be. I've already bought 2 books this year, but that budget is going to be £250. And we'll see how that goes. I've got a tracker in my book journal, which I will be keeping an eye on. I've also got a Notion tracker and things like that to keep on top of it. That's a third of what I spent this year. And I think it's doable. I really do. but we'll see how well I stick to it. That's going to be part of my reading wrap up every month. The next page in my journal is library books. I want to try and read 35 library books. It's that simple. That is, I think, very doable if I want to keep taking books out of the library rather than buying them straight away. Nothing much more to say about that. My next one, I'm going to be trying the alphabet challenge deliberately this time. I sort of did it retroactively at the end of 2022, and I spent the first chunk of this 2023 trying to finish off the difficult letters that I haven't read any books for. This time I'm doing it more deliberately. I've got a page in my journals that we'll go through at the end of every month, but essentially I want to read books that have a title starting with every letter of the alphabet. Did I phrase that right? You understand what I mean. I'm also going to count any books that have the word the. That's T. That's T every time. We don't ignore the thes, because that's cheating. I could not do it in 2022. We'll see if I can do it in 2024, but it might mean that at the end of the year we have a bit of a scramble for like Z and Y and X. X was hard last time. Maybe I'll reread X. I don't know. We'll work that one out. On top of that, just a really sort of basic one. I want to try and read a book for every colour of the rainbow, just to sort of see how hard that is really. I don't really pay attention to the colour of the books that I read, and this will be a cool insight into that. And I'm also going to try and read a book from a variety of genres that I've laid out in my journal as well, that I'll go through. I am trying to diversify my reads a little bit this year. So I have got a couple of bingo boards. The first one is specifically for diversity. I've got 9 bingo squares, but I've got a gap underneath for tally marks because I don't want this to be a one and done. Oh, I read a book by an Indigenous author this year, gold star for me, never have to do it again. Like, I don't want that mindset to come with the bingo board. So I've got tally marks underneath. So I've got spaces for disability rep, trans authors, set in an African country, because that's not a setting that I read a lot of, and I would like to, because it's a good way of learning about sort of cultures in that area of the world, which I know jack shit about. I've got a space for Black authors, Latinx authors, Indigenous authors, one for Asian inspired worlds. That's also not a setting I read a lot of and would like to see more of this year. I've got non-binary protagonist, because I don't see that a lot, and queer authors, which I think will be the easiest square on this board, but it will be interesting to see the quantities that come up for those bingo boards. I also just have a general bookish bingo board as well. Things like published the year I was born, an autobiography, one that features Halloween, one that features pirates, one that features dragons. I've got charity shop books with one word as the title, award-winning books, a cursed protagonist, things like that. But I did a 25 5x5 grid. The last two goals I have for this year are I want to clear everything off my physical TBR, which should be doable. I reckon if I work on it, that's like, I could do that by July if I wanted to. And I want to finish every series that is a finished series, so I could get to the end of it, that I am currently in the middle of. There is going to be a whole separate video about my series and where I'm at with those, because, well, there's a few. And this is a long video already. So clearing off my physical TBR, I think, is a very doable goal. What I'm interested to see is if I manage to clear everything off my Storygraph TBR, which is over 100 books long. And if I stick to it and I don't go off book and I don't read anything else that I'm interested in at all this year, I think I could finish my physical and my digital TBR. But that's quite a lot, so I don't know. We shall see about that. Those are all the sort of stats and goals for last year and this year. Let me know if anything jumps out at you, if anything seems particularly interesting. I'm interested to hear what you think, or if you are doing any sort of bingo boards and things like that. But yes, I like to gamify my reading. It makes it more interesting. It means I read more, and I am excited to show you how I get on. Happy New Year.